When we talk about receptors with cell signaling, these are the molecules that are responsible for responding to the signal. And not only do they respond to the signal, but they're also going to cause the response. So obviously, very important molecules in this whole signaling process. Now, with our receptors, one major thing to keep in mind is that they are going to be very specific. So each receptor is going to bind only a few different molecule types or different ligands. So if we were to actually look at a ligand here, this ligand is going to be kind of a lock and key type fit. So I could draw another one down here in the cell, and notice that I've tried to draw it so that it's going to be pretty much the exact size that we would need so that this could bind right there in the center. And so we have two different examples here. These would be two different receptors, and in a moment you'll see why I've drawn them a little bit different from each other. But again, any receptor that we have is going to be very specific for the ligand, shown in red or pink here, that we're actually looking at. So the first thing that has to happen is the ligand is going to bind the receptor. So first it binds, and then once we get that binding, that very specific binding, then we're going to get this response a little bit later. So we do have two different types of receptor molecules. The first type is going to be what we call an internal receptor. And these are called internal because they happen to be located inside the cell. And since they're located inside the cell, a lot of times these are called cytoplasmic receptors because they happen to be located in the cytoplasm. So if I were to draw one of these, it might be located right here. We might have a few of them scattered around the cytoplasm of the cell. And these are going to generally, not always the case, but these usually respond to some ligand molecule that is able to actually pass across that plasma membrane. So this molecule actually crosses, and since it crosses right across, it can actually make it to these receptors, and then it's going to bind to them. So if it binds to them, and again, it's a very specific binding, there's going to be some change in that receptor that's going to cause a response inside the cell. So with these small ligands, if we talk just a little bit more about them, one key is going to have to be that they are going to be small. And that is necessary if they're actually going to cross the plasma membrane. And then another thing is that they're probably going to have to be hydrophobic, so that they can get across that membrane as well. So they do tend to be small and hydrophobic. Now the changes that we get when we're talking about the internal receptors responding to some type of signaling molecule or some type of ligand, they do tend to fall into the gene expression category. And what we mean by gene expression is that we're going to get a change in mRNA production. And mRNA gets produced so that we can change the proteins that we're actually producing inside of the cell. So that tends to be the response that we get. So when we do get binding, so first we get binding of the ligand to the receptor, and then there is a change in shape, tends to be a change in shape. And then that change in shape usually is going to expose a DNA binding domain. And that DNA binding domain is going to cause that receptor to actually bind to DNA. And that in itself is going to cause this change in the RNA production. So that overall process where we actually bind to the DNA and we change the production of mRNA, we're going to increase RNA production or maybe even decrease RNA production, but that is what we call gene expression. The other type of receptor that we have is the cell surface receptor. So just like this sounds, this is going to be something that actually is located at the surface of the cell, and its job is to receive a signal from outside. So it receives the signal from outside, and then it transmits that to the inside. So in other words, we're going to tell the inside of the cell what's happening on the outside of the cell. We convert an external signal into an internal signal, is just another way to phrase it. There does tend to be 3 different parts to these cell surface receptors. They have, on the outside, first of all, they're going to have what we call an extracellular domain. This extracellular domain is the part that's actually responsible for binding to the ligand. So here we would have this ligand that comes in, and it's going to bind very specifically into the extracellular domain. Another part that we have is we have the part that actually crosses the membrane. So this is going to be a hydrophobic domain because it has to be hydrophobic if it's going to span the membrane. So this is just what's going to anchor it there in the membrane. And the third part that we have, I'm going to draw it right here. This is what we call the intracellular domain. The intracellular domain is very important because this is the domain that's actually going to be really transmitting the signal to the inside of the cell. So typically you get binding of the ligand to the extracellular domain, and then there is some change in shape that occurs in the intracellular domain. And then that change in shape that is now on the inside of the cell is going to be perceived or noticed by something inside the cell. And in that way, we get that signal transmitted from an extracellular signal to an intracellular signal.